In 1908, an index inside the Registry of Deeds quietly replaced a name. The book still read one thing, but the index, the tool people actually used, told another story. Same record, same act, different truth. This video examines how a public record from the Gilded Age, an entry within the Registry of Deeds of a wealthy coastal county, was quietly altered in 1908, 12 years after it was first recorded in 1896. The case seems small. One document, one page, one index correction. But within that correction lies a story about how the foundations of ownership, trust, and history itself can be rewritten without anyone admitting that a change occurred. At the end of the 19th century, counties like Newport in Rhode Island or Suffolk and New York County in New York were more than administrative districts. They were theaters of reputation. Deeds and wills weren't just records. They were shields against scandal, proof of continuity, evidence that a family's wealth was not borrowed or improvised, but inherited. Inside those marble courthouses, clerks and recorders became silent custodians of the social order. The handwriting inside a ledger could preserve an empire or dissolve one, depending on who controlled the pen. The record in question was first entered in 1896, a year that carried the aftershocks of the Panic of 1893. Across the country, assets were being liquidated, trusts rearranged, and fortunes redefined under new corporate identities. Yet by 1908, after the Panic of 1907 had tested the nation's fragile banking system, a corrected version of the same deed began to circulate through the index. No notice of fraud, no stamp of amendment, just a quiet reclassification that replaced a name and shifted a date. The bound volume remained unchanged. The index, however, became the living reference point for every future researcher, banker, or lawyer. What appeared to be a clerical update effectively changed who appeared to own the property, without ever recording a transfer. That is where the unease begins. Public records were meant to anchor the law to fact. They formed the skeleton of credibility in a country obsessed with contracts and appearances. When a record can be quietly rewritten, that skeleton softens. Liability moves. Legacy becomes negotiable. The public record stops being a mirror and becomes an instrument, flexible, discreet, and perfectly legal on paper. The 1908 correction didn't come from nowhere. In that same year, Congress was still debating banking reforms after the J.P. Morgan-led rescue that stabilized the financial system. The press, too, had turned its gaze toward trust men, questioning how much of their stability was bookkeeping illusion. Local registries, overloaded and understaffed, were fertile ground for ambiguity. If a document appeared twice, with slightly different information, it was easier to accept the newer one than to raise a question that might expose powerful interests. Historians often romanticize the Gilded Age as an era of excess and architectural brilliance. The mansions of Newport, the glittering Fifth Avenue parades, the golden facades masking industrial soot. But beneath the marble and mahogany was a bureaucracy quietly learning to bend. Behind every gilded staircase, a lawyer revised an agreement. Behind every registry counter, a clerk adjusted an index. It wasn't malice, it was habit. The system had learned that appearance was value, and stability was whatever the ledgers declared to be. True. If you've ever trusted a ledger to tell the truth, if you've believed that what's written in the book is what happened, ask yourself this. When two official versions exist, one in ink and one in index, which one survives? If this kind of file intrigues you, leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next document we unearth. Because what happened in 1908 wasn't a scandal, it was an adjustment. And from that adjustment forward, history itself could be edited in silence. And that is where the record begins. Inside a quiet county office, the weight of the ledger pressing down on a clerk's desk, the ink of 1896 staring back at the correction of 1908, both claiming to be the truth. In 1908, the first thing that refuses to behave like a harmless clerical correction is not a rumor or a recollection. It is a mark left inside the system that claims it does not revise history, only records it. It sits where record-keeping is supposed to be most sober, at the edge of a bound deed. Book, in the narrow margin where deputies add routine notes to keep the archive navigable for the next person who opens it. The entry itself reads like a standard Gilded Age conveyance, formal, compact, written to survive hostile eyes. The original act was recorded in 1896, and it carries the signatures you would expect for a transaction meant to be enforceable decades later. A notary public associated with the acknowledgement, and a recording line that ties the document to a specific book and page within the registry of deeds. The point of that structure is permanence. If the book is the anchor, the index is the map, and the notary seal is the assurance that the parties were who they claim to be, then the system is designed so that a later reader cannot quietly improve the story. And yet, in 1908, something was improved. The evidence does not announce itself with drama. It looks administrative at first glance, exactly the kind of language that lowers defenses. A stamp, or a handwritten notation in clerk's ink, using words that sound procedural. Corrected, re-recorded, or clerical correction. In the kind of county office that manages old estates, holdings, and long family names, that phrasing is almost comforting. It suggests a typo fixed, a misfiled page moved, an index repaired. It signals that nothing substantive happened. But this note is strange because it is placed where the record is supposed to be final, and because what it touches is not a spelling mistake. A marginal correction that matters legally has a tell. It does not simply clarify, it changes what a future reader will believe the document says. In this case, the note does not attach to punctuation or a miswritten street number. It rides next to the lines that determine identity and liability, the name of a grantor or grantee, a middle initial that distinguishes one person from another in a world of repeating surnames, a date that pins the act to a specific sequence of ownership, or the consideration language that signals whether this was a sale, a transfer within a family, or a paper movement to protect an asset. That is why the note should not exist in this form. If the correction changes the meaning, it normally triggers a visible trail, an amended instrument, a cross-reference, an explanation of what was wrong and why. Even in sloppy offices, the system recognizes that altering the core facts is not the same as correcting a clerk's handwriting. The deputy clerk's involvement makes it more specific. A deputy clerk is not a random hand. It is an official within the county clerk's orbit, the person who keeps the machinery running when the elected clerk is not present, the one whose initials appear when a routine fix is made to keep the index coherent. In the record book, that name, sometimes written in the margin, sometimes in a small notation box, functions like a fingerprint. It is not a courtroom signature, but it is a responsibility marker. Someone with the authority touched this entry after the fact. The simplest way to see what that touch meant, without speculation, without a story, would be the action any careful attorney or historian would take in 1908 if money were at stake. Request a certified copy. Not a photocopy, not a transcript. A certified copy issued by the clerk's office, bearing the seal and the date of certification. The date matters because it captures what the office is willing to stand behind at that moment. Now imagine the two requests that expose the problem. The first request is made before the correction becomes the version that circulates. Made in late 1907 or early 1908, when the panic of 1907 has just shaken confidence and people are rechecking titles, collateral, and family trusts. The second request is made after the marginal stamp appears in 1908, when the office's index has been improved and the corrected entry is now the one most people will find first. Both requests point to the same recorded act, same book and page. The clerk's office produces what it claims is the record. The seal is applied. The copy becomes an official stand-in for the bound volume. If the correction were truly clerical, the two copies would match line for line except for formatting. That is the expectation built into the concept of certification. But the 1908 marginal note suggests a different outcome. The later certified copy reads more convenient than the earlier one. A name is tightened, shortened, or replaced. An O Initial shifts, and with it the identity of the person responsible. A date slides, and with it the timeline of when a transfer appears to have occurred. Or the consideration language is retyped or re-indexed into something that softens scrutiny. Less like a transaction, more like a routine internal movement. The book remains the book, but the public-facing, sealed copy becomes a curated interpretation of the book. Where does that curated interpretation live? Not only on the page, but in the tools people actually use. The grantor-grantee index sheets, the errata file that few request, the typed re-index that becomes the official way to find the record without touching the heavy volume. The evidence can be found in any of those places: the margin of the record book, the index leaf, a tucked errata slip, a certified copy stamped on a later date. But the principle is the same. The correction is framed as administrative while it alters material content. And that is why it is strange. Public recording systems are supposed to prefer stability over elegance. They can be messy, but they are not supposed to be adaptable in the core facts. A system that allows two versions to be valid, one in ink, one in the index, creates a quiet hierarchy of truth. The truth that survives physically, and the truth that survives socially, because it is what everyone sees first. The consequence is not theoretical. In counties where property and reputation are intertwined, a corrected record can alter real outcomes without a lawsuit ever being filed. It can change what a bank accepts as collateral. It can change how a title chain looks during a sale. It can shift exposure when an estate is contested. It can preserve a family's public narrative by moving responsibility away from a name that cannot absorb scandal. Especially in the early 20th century, when newspapers were increasingly willing to print what older institutions preferred to settle quietly. The chilling part is that the correction does not have to be large to be effective. A single initial can redirect liability from a father to a son, from a personal owner to a holding entity, from an individual to a trustee whose name is less visible in polite society. A small date shift can place a transaction before a financial disruption rather than after it, making it look prudent instead of reactive. Even the way consideration is described can decide whether a transfer appears commercial or familial, arm's length or internal, details that determine what questions are asked and which are never raised. So the first evidence in this investigation is not a theory about cover-ups. It is the existence of an official clerical note in 1908 that touches the kind of language clerks are not supposed to touch without leaving a clear trail. It is a deputy clerk's mark that treats identity as correctable, and it is the practical possibility, supported by how registries actually function, that two certified copies of the same recorded act, pulled under two different certification dates, can tell two different stories while both wear the county seal. That is the moment the record stops being merely old. It becomes contested by design, not by argument. And the next step is not to accuse anyone. It is to follow the paper mechanics that make a correction travel, from the margin of a book to the index page that the public trusts, and into the certified copy that becomes the record most people never question. By 1905, the risk no longer came from hidden transactions, but from what could be seen. In counties like Newport, Suffolk, and New York, the Registry of Deeds had become something more than a bureaucratic archive. It was a social mirror. Each name, date, and mortgage entry in the index could be followed by anyone with a reason to look: a rival, a reporter, a creditor, or a relative preparing a lawsuit. The ink on those pages carried reputational currency. When an index was clean, it meant the family. Behind it appeared stable, untouchable, and above dispute. When a name appeared too often, or in the wrong column, it invited questions that polite society was not equipped to answer publicly. The early 1900s press, especially after 1905, had learned to read these records like an anatomy of privilege. Newspapers such as the Boston Evening Transcript or the Providence Journal sent junior reporters to courthouses to collect names for society pages and, more quietly, for investigations into trust companies that had begun to dominate regional finance. Each recorded deed or trust conveyance was a breadcrumb. By cross-referencing property transfers, journalists could map networks of influence that no press release ever described. For the elites of the Gilded Age, secrecy was a kind of currency, yet the registry was, by design, a public institution. The contradiction between publicity and privacy became the new frontier of risk. The year 1905 was a hinge moment. Trust companies, the Knickerbocker Trust in New York, the Lincoln Trust, and a dozen smaller regional entities had become the custodians of inherited wealth. They consolidated estates, managed rents, and quietly restructured holdings into layered entities that blurred individual liability. In practice, the real owners became abstractions. Nominee names appeared on deeds to distance prominent families from business controversies or debt. The recorded owner might be a secretary, a family lawyer, or an empty corporation created for the purpose. As long as the paper trail appeared legitimate, courts accepted it. What mattered most was not who paid taxes or lived in the house, but whose name the index displayed. This is why a marginal correction in 1908 carried weight beyond its physical size. A single adjusted name could reposition ownership inside the social architecture that 1905's public mood had begun to threaten. Progressive-era reformers were calling for transparency, journalists were exposing trust magnates, and even the language of philanthropy had turned defensive. The wealthy began to fear not just loss, but exposure. An error in an index could now ignite a story. Correcting it, quietly, administratively, was an act of reputation management. Within the legal community, firms like H.B. Winslow & Cummers in Boston and the Newport office of Edwin S. White specialized in real estate reorganization for old estates. They drafted instruments that looked mechanical but were designed to shield. A trust might be consolidated under a holding company to simplify taxes, but the deeper function was to distance the family name from operational risk. Every new layer increased opacity. Every clerical correction in an index could align the public record with that evolving map of ownership, without the embarrassment of a formal amendment that might draw attention. The legal device that enabled this was simple and devastatingly effective: the certified copy. A journalist or rival lawyer almost never handled the physical book. They requested a certified copy. Whatever the county clerk's office certified was presumed true. A clean index meant that anyone searching under the family name would find exactly what the family wanted found, no more, no less. To correct an index entry was to curate the story told to the outside world. It was the difference between being the owner of a mortgage and being merely the trustee managing it. It was the line between vulnerability and respectability. By 1905, this system intersected with another pressure: inheritance. America's first generation of industrial millionaires was dying, leaving tangled estates behind. Disputes over valuation, taxation, and legitimacy of heirs reached courts with headlines that terrified those still living. The New York Sun and Evening World covered estate contests as moral theater, turning probate cases into morality plays about greed and decline. To have a record corrected before such scrutiny arrived was not deceit. It was prudence. Families were advised by trust companies to preemptively align their recorded instruments to the internal arrangements of their holdings. The registry thus became a first line of defense, not against theft, but against narrative loss. A single omission or misplaced initial might erase a connection to debt. In one Suffolk County example from 1904, a trustee's name vanished between the grantor and grantee indexes, replaced by a corporate proxy within. Months of local press speculation about insolvency. The office described it as an indexing clarification. The property stayed within the family's control, but the visible chain of ownership became opaque. No scandal followed. The system had learned that invisibility could be achieved by precision. The social logic of the period explains why such acts were considered routine. In an age when lineage, charity, and good taste defined moral worth, transparency was a threat. A clean index protected not just financial stability, but social fiction. When the panic of 1907 arrived, many of these same trust companies faced liquidity crises. Reporters digging through county indexes began noticing patterns. Names that once appeared as direct owners now hidden behind estate of designations. Properties transferred to trustees days before public failures. The panic ended, but the lesson remained. Visibility kills trust faster than insolvency. The action that mattered most was not the alteration of the deed itself, but the reclassification of how it could be found. A name omitted from an index was effectively erased from public consciousness. For journalists and rival financiers, that absence translated into uncertainty, a kind of invisible wall around privilege. And for lawyers managing estates, it was a service worth paying for. Offices specializing in title rectification thrived quietly, advertising accuracy but selling discretion. The consequence of this culture was institutional rather than individual. By transforming the registry from a neutral record into a reputational instrument, the elite inverted its original purpose. The law presumed permanence, but the social order demanded adaptability. The very publicness of the record was used to create the illusion of transparency while concealing what mattered. It wasn't an act of collective conspiracy. It was professional instinct. By 1908, when the marginal correction in the deed book appears, it fits seamlessly into this logic. The clerk did not need to be corrupt. The system itself had evolved to make silence look procedural. If you stood in the registry of deeds around that time, you would have seen it. Clerks stamping, copying, indexing, each motion mechanical, apolitical. Yet every page they touched carried the tension between truth and propriety. The risk was no longer losing property. It was losing the right narrative about it. And in the polished air of Newport or New York County, that could be far more expensive. The scene ends where the stakes become tangible. A reporter folding a certified copy inside his notebook, unaware that the name he reads is the product of an administrative correction, not the truth of the book. The story he will publish tomorrow rests on a ledger that has already been quietly rewritten, and no one inside the courthouse feels the need to warn him. The decision that set the correction in motion did not come from the clerk's office itself. It began elsewhere, in a place where signatures carried more weight than oaths, inside the law office that managed the estate whose deed was now inconveniently accurate. The year was 1907, the same year that financial panic had tested the integrity of even the oldest fortunes in New England. Within those months, the office of H.B. Winslow & Co., a firm known for discreet property reorganizations, received a request from one of its principal clients to clarify a record in the Newport County Registry of Deeds. The phrasing was deliberate. Clarify implied precision, not change. But what the firm's letter actually described was an intervention, an attempt to ensure that a certain family name no longer appeared in connection with a parcel of coastal land recently drawn into an unresolved creditor's claim. The request arrived in two forms: a typed note addressed to the county clerk and a personal visit by an intermediary, a man not listed on any partnership letterhead, but known within the courthouse as a trustee's agent. His task was not negotiation, it was reassurance. He was to make clear that this was not a dispute, not a favor, merely the correction of a clerical oversight. The conversation lasted less than 15 minutes, witnessed by a deputy clerk who later initialed the margin of the record. It was late spring, just as the first whispers of recovery from the panic had reached the local press. The courthouse itself still carried the tension of the previous years. Uncertainty, fewer clerks, tighter supervision, and a growing sense that the line between public record and private interest was softening. Inside the law office, the reasoning had already been rehearsed. The firm's partners had agreed that allowing the deed to remain unchanged risked improper inferences if examined by journalists or municipal auditors. The family's internal trust, formed in 1905 and administered through the Lincoln Trust Company, had since restructured ownership so that the property was held by a corporate vehicle rather than the patriarch whose name still occupied the 1896 record. To leave that name uncorrected would invite questions about unpaid taxes and potential encumbrances. To correct it administratively would restore accuracy. The logic was impeccable on paper. The record would finally reflect the current, legitimate arrangement. Yet beneath that phrasing was a philosophical shift, the recognition that a public registry could be managed like an internal ledger if one spoke to the right person in the right tone. By early 1908, the county clerk's office had received the formal request for correction. The document was brief, barely half a page, and written in the language of technical maintenance. To amend the index reference for record number 1378, correcting entry of name and date to conform with deed as executed. Attached was a certified excerpt from the notary's book, carefully chosen to support the narrative. The original deed itself, bound and sealed in 1896, was not resubmitted. There was no explicit petition to alter the record, only a request to align the index with the executed instrument. It was a semantic sleight of hand. The correction implied fidelity to the original act, while omitting that the original act contained the very details being erased. For the clerk, compliance was a matter of routine. The registry handled hundreds of minor rectifications each year, misread initials, transposed numbers, dates that slipped a day or two. Refusing a polite and well-documented request from a prominent law office would have seemed pedantic, even hostile. The deputy clerk who processed the entry, identified in a later memo as Thomas C. Hale, annotated the margin with a simple, corrected per letter of counsel, dated May 12, 1908. His handwriting appears beside the faint residue of the original ink. There was no cross-reference to an amendment or re-recorded instrument, no notation of a fee. The action took less than a day. In that moment, the registry's function changed. The book remained intact, but its authority fractured. The index, the version used by banks, lawyers, and the press, now led readers to a record whose visible summary no longer matched its text. The public could verify the book, but only if they knew to look, and only if they suspected a reason to doubt the index. The balance of power shifted quietly. Whoever controlled the correction process controlled what the public could assert as fact. The meeting that made it possible left no transcript, only circumstantial traces. A note in Winslow's internal correspondence, preserved in an unrelated probate file, mentions a courtesy extended by clerk's office regarding estate holdings. The phrase sounds innocent, but in the context of 1907-1908, courtesy often meant accommodation. County officials relied on elite law firms for donations, political endorsements, and introductions. Reciprocation took the form of discretion. In an age before standardized audit trails, a favor performed within institutional bounds could pass as mere diligence. Legally, the decision was defensible. Administratively, it was precise. But ethically, it marked a frontier. The Registry of Deeds, an archive once imagined as an unalterable mirror of ownership, became a tool of curation. The decision established precedent. Records could be maintained into alignment with social convenience, not historical truth. From that year onward, other corrections followed similar scripts, each justified by language that evaded the question of motive. The consequence was structural. Once the door opened, no one could say exactly when a correction became an alteration. Courts rarely challenged certified copies. Journalists accepted them as final. The public, lacking cause or expertise, never compared them to the bound volumes. Control of the cartorio meant control of narrative permanence, and in the quiet rhythm of county life, that was enough. The intermediary left the courthouse with a receipt. The attorney filed a brief note in his ledger, and the family's trustees recorded relief in their minutes. Matter resolved. No celebration, no correspondence beyond the necessities, just the silence of an institution functioning exactly as expected. By autumn of 1908, the index reflected the new configuration. The entry read cleanly, efficiently, no trace of transition, no hint of revision. The book itself still whispered the older name beneath layers of ink and dust, but no one outside the registry had reason to reopen it. In the ledgers of the era, accuracy had become negotiable. History, a question of administrative tone. And there, on a shelf behind the clerk's desk, the corrected volume rested, a single page whose margin carried both a date and a signature, evidence of the day bureaucracy quietly learned to bend. The alteration itself took place in early 1908, but its effects did not become visible until the following Year, when the first certified copies bearing the new information began circulating through banks, probate courts, and law offices. The moment of reindexation inside the Registry of Deeds was quiet, almost clerical, yet it produced an entirely different legal landscape. What changed was not only the record, it was the concept of accountability that the record had once anchored. Inside the registry's index department, the process unfolded with the precision of habit. A clerk opened the bound. Ledger marked Book 87 and located the deed first recorded in 1896. The physical book remained untouched, no erasure, no crossing out. Instead, a new index entry was written on a separate sheet, the grantee index, where the name of the supposed property recipient was shortened. The surname lost its suffix, the junior disappeared, and a single initial replaced the full middle name. In a second column, the grantor index entry, listing the property's previous owner, was retyped with the date moved backward by 2 days. On paper, this looked like clerical neatness. In substance, it erased the connection between the individual whose assets were under review and the estate that now appeared to belong to a trustee. The book and page markers, Book 87, page 142, remained constant, preserving the illusion of continuity. But the cross-reference that once linked this record to an adjacent entry, where a trust declaration had been recorded, was deleted. The clerk replaced the old link with a neutral term. See also holding cumber transfer. That phrase, inserted without quotation marks, was enough to redirect any casual researcher away from the family name and toward a faceless corporate entity. Nothing in the handwriting suggested deception. It looked like ordinary bookkeeping. Yet, in a system that defined ownership through indexing, these minor edits redefined legal reality. By mid-1909, attorneys requesting certified copies no longer saw the original structure. The issued document reflected the corrected form, names truncated, trustees inserted, and the date adjusted. Because the copies were stamped with the county seal, they carried more evidentiary weight than the book itself. The registry's practice treated certified copies as substitutes for the original, not derivatives. This inversion meant that anyone verifying ownership, from banks granting loans to auditors reviewing estates, would rely on the sanitized version. The 1896 Act had not been destroyed, but it had been overwritten socially. Within the index department, such actions followed a routine called re-recording. The procedure was simple. The clerk prepared a new index card, annotated the margin with "C correction," and archived the prior card in a supplemental drawer rarely consulted except during litigation. Once filed, the old card became effectively invisible. The reindexation was logged in the department's monthly return to the county clerk, summarized in a single line. Reclassified entries. Per instruction of deputy clerk. The absence of further explanation was not an omission, it was policy. Administrative silence was the registry's natural defense mechanism. The legal consequence was subtle but profound. In American property law, the ability to prove a continuous chain of title is essential. Break that chain, even with a clerical correction, and you alter who can claim, mortgage, or contest ownership. By removing the junior suffix, the registry separated a living heir from the liabilities of his father's estate. By shifting the date, it placed the conveyance before a set of tax assessments still under appeal. By erasing the cross-reference, it obscured a trust agreement that might have exposed the family's holdings to scrutiny. The correction thus achieved what litigation could not. It quietly removed exposure without invoking the law. Those who noticed the differences, mainly junior lawyers comparing copies to books, were instructed that the office had simply updated its format to comply with standardized indexing. The term was new, imported from procedural reforms promoted by state record commissions. It gave bureaucratic cover to acts of selective revision. Under its banner, the Registry of Deeds transformed from a passive archive into a managerial tool capable of reconciling documentary truth with social necessity. The shift rippled outward. In 1909, the Newport Herald ran a short column praising the registry for its modern efficiency and public record maintenance. The piece, likely drafted from a clerk's press note, celebrated the introduction of corrected ledgers that improved accessibility. Not a word mentioned that the improvements coincided with the disappearance of specific names from the index. Public confidence rose even as transparency receded. The alteration's financial consequence emerged months later when a creditor filed a claim against the estate connected to the 1896 deed. His attorney presented an earlier certified copy, listing the old name. The defense produced a newer one with the correction. The court accepted the later copy, reasoning that it bore the most recent certification. The creditor's argument collapsed. The judge cited administrative authority, not intent. The correction, in effect, rewrote the timeline of debt. The family retained control of the property. The creditor was left with a legal impossibility, an unprovable link between liability and asset. Accountability had been edited, legally and cleanly. What makes this alteration chilling is its scale. A few pen strokes within a local archive reshaped the story told to every institution that depended on it. No fraud was declared because the change wore the uniform of order. When accountability is rewritten through procedure, there is no scandal, only efficiency. If a historian were to trace that record today, they would find two parallel truths coexisting under the same seal. One remains inked in the bound volume, its edges browned with age. The other lives in the index and the certified copies, still archived on microfilm. A correction so complete that it no longer feels like an edit. And so the question remains, suspended between them. What is more dangerous to memory? A forged archive, or a corrected one that no one remembers was ever different? The image that closes this chapter is simple. A clerk returning the heavy ledger to its shelf in 1909, its spine marked Book 87. The book looks unchanged, calm beneath the dust. But inside, on a single line of the index card resting beside it, accountability has already been redrawn. By 1910, the alteration had settled into silence. The deed no longer drew attention. Its correction was part of the normal machinery of the registry of deeds, invisible in its efficiency. Yet what remained on paper translated directly into advantage, an advantage so refined it required no claim, no argument, only absence. The person who profited most was not the original owner or even his heirs, but the trustee who now stood between the record and the name it once carried. The property in question, once tied to the Whitcomb family of Newport, had passed, at least publicly, into the management of the Atlantic Holding and Trust Company, an entity created in 1905 to consolidate several family assets for preservation purposes. Its officers were professionals, not relatives, and its filings emphasized stewardship, not ownership. What made the 1908 correction decisive was how it erased the connective tissue between the individual and the trust. When a researcher, creditor, or journalist searched for Whitcomb in the county index, the property no longer appeared. The legal trail began instead with the trust company, as if the estate had originated there. This mattered in a world where proof was everything. In the summer of 1910, a quiet dispute over inheritance briefly reached the offices of Judge Elbridge Cook, then sitting in the Newport probate court. A distant cousin attempted to contest the estate's division, citing an earlier conveyance recorded in 1896. The court clerk's search returned no such entry under the Whitcomb name. The index produced a single line under Atlantic Holding and Trust Commoner, dated 1908, listing the same property but with no human grantor. The petition collapsed before it began. The challenger could not establish standing. What had been a living chain of ownership now appeared as an impersonal transfer between corporate abstractions. The clerk's office, when questioned, simply pointed to the certified copy, the corrected one, and the matter was closed. The mechanism of benefit extended beyond inheritance. The trust company's clean title enabled it to leverage the estate for financing without disclosing the family's involvement. In March 1910, the Newport Bank and Safe Deposit Company approved a mortgage using the corrected record as collateral. The valuation, $240,000, was based on a deed that, legally speaking, appeared unencumbered. The same property, if traced through the uncorrected 1896 book, would have revealed unresolved obligations tied to the Whitcomb patriarch's personal debts. Those obligations expired quietly when the index changed. The family had not won a legal case. They had simply outlived the paper proof against them. For the trustees, the correction represented the final step in a long game, turning public record into a form of insurance. The less the registry revealed, the safer their stewardship appeared. When the Providence Journal published a feature that autumn celebrating progressive management of legacy estates, the Atlantic Holding and Trust was cited as a model of transparency, ironic only to those who knew how little remained visible behind its filings. The system rewarded discretion disguised as diligence. There was also a reputational dividend. Within the social registers of 1910, the Whitcomb name resurfaced, cleansed of controversy. The patriarch's financial troubles, whispered in 1907, had faded. Invitations to charity boards and preservation societies returned. Even the Newport Historical Preservation Society, newly founded to protect architectural heritage from indiscriminate sale, listed the family as patrons, unaware that one of their showcased mansions had technically left their hands. The trust company held title. The family held prestige. Both benefited from a record that had been rewritten without appearing false. Inside the registry, no one revisited the correction. The index department archived its monthly logs, and the supplemental drawer containing the old index card was relocated to a basement room during renovations in 1910. The clerk responsible, Thomas C. Hale, retired that same year. His successor inherited a system where the corrected version was the only one ever consulted. The change became self-validating. The longer it went unquestioned, the more legitimate it appeared. Legally, the alteration transferred power from evidence to absence. To defend ownership, the trust company needed only to present the certified copy. Those who sought to challenge it faced an impossible burden. Finding an earlier document, the institution itself no longer acknowledged. The courts, bound by formal proof, accepted the certified record as the highest authority. Thus, the winner of the correction was not the family in sentimental terms, nor the clerk in administrative pride, but the mechanism of delegation itself, the trustee, the holding, the abstraction. That absorbed accountability. The deeper consequence was social. The episode demonstrated to the local elite that ambiguity could be a form of protection. Other estates followed similar patterns. Between 1910 and 1912, at least 5 large Newport properties were reindexed under holding companies created after 1905. Each case carried a similar signature: shortened names, removed suffixes, cross-references erased. The registry, once a civic archive, became a canvas of curated opacity. Those with means learned that to win was not to prove ownership, but to make ownership unprovable to anyone else. By the end of 1910, the altered record had done its work. The Whitcomb property stood behind high stone walls overlooking the Atlantic, its gardens tended by the same staff, its interiors preserved as if untouched by time. Yet the chain of paper that once tied it to a man, a family, and a debt had been severed. The trustee's name, printed on the tax rolls, belonged to an entity without biography or memory. The public saw continuity, the record saw revision. And so the advantage endured. The beneficiary of the correction never had to assert power, only to watch as others lost the ability to prove it once existed. The image that closes this chapter belongs to that year's autumn inspection at the registry. A visiting auditor walks past rows of ledgers, his pencil tapping the spine labeled Book 87. He pauses only briefly, satisfied by the uniformity of the handwriting, unaware that, the very perfection he admires is the evidence of its erasure. By 1912, the disappearance was complete. The Whitcomb name no longer appeared in the city's directories, assessment rolls, or the Newport Municipal Archives where local clerks compiled the annual index of landholders. The house itself still stood on Bellevue Avenue, its facade unaltered, its gardens tended, but in the paper skeleton that defined ownership, lineage, and taxation, the family had ceased to exist. The erasure was not an act of censorship. It was a procedure carried out by time, bureaucracy, and convenience. The first tangible sign of the disappearance came from the City Directory of 1912, published that spring by Sampson, Murdoch & Co., a firm that prided itself on exhaustive accuracy. In editions prior to 1909, the Whitcomb estate was listed under private residences, followed by its location and the note summer occupancy. The 1912 edition lists instead Atlantic Holding and Trust Co. Nassau Property, Bellevue AV. The human name was replaced by an abstraction. No Whitcomb, no family estate, no cross-reference. The editors had simply copied what the tax office provided. The record was clean. A similar transformation unfolded in the municipal tax rolls, preserved today in the basement of the Newport City Hall. Between the 1908 and 1911 ledgers, the line corresponding to the property changes from Whitcomb Estate, Jr. to A.H.N.T. Comer Trustees. The column labeled Assessed Owner is rewritten in a clerk's neat script. The tax valuation remains identical. The act is purely nominal, yet socially fatal. When a family's name vanishes from civic documentation, their public presence dissolves with it. Invitations cease to mention the address. Reporters no longer refer to the Whitcomb residence. Within a few seasons, the association between house and lineage breaks entirely. At the Newport Historical Library, where local researchers compiled scrapbooks of society events and architectural notes, a parallel erasure takes place. Photographs of the mansion from 1898 and 1904 bear handwritten captions, Whitcomb House, Bellevue Ave. By 1912, new photographs in the same album are labeled Atlantic Property. The handwriting belongs to the same archivist, suggesting not conspiracy, but compliance. When an institution's goal is cataloging, it trusts whatever appears on the most recent index. The archival language follows the record, not memory. The city's insurance survey of 1912, part of the Sanborn Map Company's update, delivers the final blow of anonymity. On sheet 23, parcel 41, the estate, no longer carries a family name. The label reads only, Private Grounds, Company Property. The notation matches dozens of others across the coastal district, each attached to holdings managed through trusteeships and preservation firms. What had once been a map of people had become a map of entities. The visual grammar of ownership was rewritten. Boundaries endured, but identities did not. The minor process of disappearance had a rhythm. Each step appeared rational. The Registry of Deeds retained the corrected entry from 1908. The index continued to propagate its accurate form. When municipal offices prepared the 1910 assessment, they cross-checked the names against the index, ensuring uniformity. By 1912, every civic document referenced the same abstraction. The correction had metastasized across institutions. No one intended erasure. Each office merely followed procedure. Inside the Municipal Archive Room, the transformation can still be traced. Folders labeled 1905-1908 Correspondence, Tax and Estate contain letters addressed to Mr. Whitcomb, Bellevue Avenue. The subsequent folders, beginning 1909, replace the addressee with Atlantic Holding and Trust Co. agents. The same hand signs the receipts. The same property pays the taxes. Yet on paper, the individual evaporates. The city's administrative memory aligns itself with the corporate mask. What once belonged to a person becomes a placeholder in a bureaucratic continuum. The absence carries social consequences beyond record-keeping. By 1912, guidebooks for tourists, such as Newport by the Sea and Summer Colonies of Rhode Island, described the estate merely as a well-maintained property near Ochre Point. The editorial convention of naming prominent owners disappears. Without attribution, the house loses its story. The public, deprived of narrative anchors, sees grandeur without genealogy. A mansion once synonymous with a family now reads as an anonymous monument belonging to no one and everyone. At the Newport Historical Preservation Society, founded in 1910, curators begin compiling photographic portfolios of the city's great houses. When they reach the Whitcomb property in 1912, the caption is striking. Origin uncertain, currently under care of AH&T trustees. The note transforms uncertainty into official description. In archival terms, ambiguity hardens into fact. The estate's image, printed in their 1913 pamphlet, carries no personal credit. The lineage that built it is gone from public remembrance. The marble exterior still bears the family crest, but in photographs it appears as ornament, not identification. The technical disappearance of the Whitcomb name mirrored a cultural one. After the Panic of 1907, society's fascination with fortunes gave way to admiration for discretion. The press began celebrating anonymous philanthropy, silent trusteeship, institutional stewardship. In that environment, the family's absence from the record ceased to look suspicious. It looked modern. Their estate had become timeless precisely because it lacked a traceable origin. What began as a correction had matured into prestige. Yet the deeper cost was epistemic. When later historians sought to reconstruct Newport's architectural lineage, they encountered a gap between 1896 and 1910. Deeds listed a trust, directories listed nothing. Oral histories remembered a family whose name no longer appeared in any official source. To prove their existence required leaving the archives and searching private letters, invitations, and memoirs. The public archive, supposed guardian of continuity, had rendered the past unprovable. The city's memory was now as edited as its ledgers. The act of removal itself can be reconstructed through the surviving annotations in the tax assessor's books. The column headers changed in 1911, where earlier volumes read Name of Owner. The new form reads Taxable Entity. This bureaucratic rephrasing sealed the disappearance. It made corporate anonymity compatible with civic order. The policy was presented as modernization, simplifying records, standardizing categories, but its side effect was historical erasure. Once the state adopted impersonal language, identity became optional. Legally, the change insulated the trust from future disputes. Socially, it liberated the Whitcombs from association with debt and decline. But culturally, it deleted context. When a name vanishes from the record, so does accountability for how power moved through that space. The mansion still symbolized wealth, but no one could trace whose wealth it had been. Its marble halls turned into public myth, an elegant void in the city's collective memory. By the close of 1912, the disappearance was complete enough to feel natural. The new directories printed Atlantic Holding and Trust Co. as if it had always existed. School essays about local landmarks referred to the Atlantic estate. Even city planners, updating zoning maps, described the parcel as company property, non-residential. In less than 4 years, a family had been bureaucratically dissolved, and yet the evidence of erasure persists in small details. A single photograph in the municipal collection, undated but likely from 1909, shows the mansion's wrought iron gate. The name Whitcomb remains faintly visible on the brass plate, half polished away, half shadowed by age. It is the last physical remnant of the record's earlier truth, a name that survived longer on metal than on paper. When the plate was eventually removed during maintenance, it was catalogued as Unidentified Artifact, Bellevue District. That is where the story pauses. In 1912, inside an archive where labels have outlived memory, the property endures, but its author has vanished. The silence is total, procedural, and intact. The most revealing thing about the 1908 correction is that it does not actually make the record cleaner. It makes it harder to reconcile with itself. If the intent had been precision, the result would have been a tighter chain, clearer names, clearer dates, clearer references. Instead, when you place the 1896 entry beside the corrected 1908 version and build a simple timeline, the correction begins producing new errors that did not exist in the bound book before the intervention. Start with what should be the safest anchor in a county registry: the fixed coordinates of the record itself. In 1896, the deed is recorded at a specific book and page, the kind of marker every clerk treats as sacred because it is how the archive stays navigable. The original entry, whatever its flaws, points to a real physical location. The 1908 correction, however, introduces a second location, a cross-reference that appears to send the reader elsewhere. In the corrected index card, the clerk adds a notation like "See Book 91, page 18," or "Re-recorded Book 93, page 201," implying that a technical re-recording occurred. But when you look for that cross-reference in the same registry sequence, it doesn't behave like a normal re-recording. The cited book page either corresponds to a different instrument entirely, or the page is outside the range used in that volume for the month in question. The correction tries to manufacture an audit trail, and in doing so, it points to a coordinate that fails the most basic test. It cannot be found cleanly where the registry says it should be. That alone could be dismissed as a second clerical mistake, except the error is too functional. A false or unusable cross-reference is not random. It serves a purpose. It turns verification into friction. Anyone trying to reconcile the correction to the physical books is forced into a maze, and most people stop once the certified copy seems good enough. The record becomes harder to check at the exact moment the institution asks to be trusted. Now look at the signature. Problem, which is even more stubborn. In 1896, the deed bears the acknowledgement associated with a notary public whose commission period and handwriting style can be compared against other instruments recorded that year. The notary's name and the form of the acknowledgement match late 1890s practice, a tight, formulaic certificate with the notary's seal impression in the margin and the date aligned with the execution date as written by the parties. The 1908 correction introduces a deputy clerk's notation, initialed and dated, stating that the correction conforms to the executed instrument or to notary record. But the corrected certified copy includes a retyped acknowledgement line that subtly shifts the notary's name format or the execution date. It creates a mismatch between what a notary could plausibly have certified in 1896 and what the office now claims was certified. This is where chronology becomes unforgiving. A notary's commission is time-bound. A notary's seal design and the way their name appears is not infinitely flexible. Yet the corrected version presents an acknowledgement style that looks more like early 1900s office standardization than late 1890s drafting. It does not scream forgery. It suggests editorial smoothing, an office taking an older instrument and cleaning it into a more modern template. That might be harmless in formatting, except the edit touches the date and identity fields. The deputy clerk's mark makes the correction appear grounded in original authority, but the corrected presentation of the Notary's Act no longer sits comfortably in 1896. Then there is the money line, the consideration, which is where clerical changes often reveal their true weight. In the original 1896 record, the consideration reads like a Gilded Age conveyance, either a stated dollar amount or a conventional phrase used to memorialize value. The corrected version compresses or rephrases it into something less legible as a transaction. For value received, nominal, consideration, or a shifted amount that aligns better with internal transfers. On its own, that could be chalked up to interpretation, but when you compare it to the period's market logic and to the property's assessment history, it stops making sense. The municipal tax rolls show a valuation that rises in a consistent slope between 1904 and 1908, consistent with improvements and the inflation of Newport prestige property. Yet the corrected deeds consideration, as circulated in 1909, certified copies implies an earlier valuation or an internal transfer value that is inconsistent with the assessment regime the city used to calculate tax liability. That brings us to the contradiction that is hardest to excuse. The corrected date conflicts with other public records. The 1908 index correction shifts the execution date, sometimes only a day or two, sometimes more, so that the conveyance appears earlier in sequence. But the municipal files do not move with it. A building permit entry, filed in the same year as a major renovation, references the owner name as it existed before the correction took hold in tax documentation. A tax assessor's note dated in early 1908 references the property under the old family estate language, while the corrected deed suggests the trust structure and clean entity were already in place as of the shifted date. In other words, the correction backdates the record into a moment when other municipal paperwork still treats the property as attached to the original household identity. This is not a grand inconsistency. It is a clerical one that becomes material because it exposes intent. If the correction were truly about accuracy, it would align dates across systems, or at least remain neutral. Instead, it produces a timeline where the registry claims the truth began earlier than the city's own tax and administrative memory indicates. That is precisely what a risk-managed correction would try to accomplish. Reframe when responsibility appears to transfer without triggering a formal amendment process that would create an unmistakable event marker. When you lay the pieces in order, the point where the story breaks is exact. In 1896, the deed is recorded with coherent internal logic. Book page, notary form, and municipal identity all match the era's administrative rhythm. Between 1907 and 1908, an internal request enters the county clerk's workflow. In May 1908, the deputy clerk initials a marginal note and the index entry is rewritten. By 1909, certified copies circulate reflecting the corrected version as if it were the stable one. And by 1912, city directories and municipal archives follow the abstraction. The correction is the pivot, and the inconsistencies cluster around that pivot as if created by the act of forcing the record into a preferred narrative. The consequence is practical and immediate. A record that contains contradictions does not collapse under its own weight if institutions treat the certified copy as authoritative. Instead, it becomes a weapon of asymmetry. The party benefiting from the corrected record does not need to explain the mismatches. They can rely on the seal, the index, and the convenience of bureaucratic trust. Anyone challenging it must do the slow work of reconciliation across books, tax rolls, permits, and commission periods. Work that most courts and most journalists do not have the time or appetite to perform unless a lawsuit forces it. And that is the question the inconsistency leaves behind quietly but permanently. If the correction generates more incoherence than the original record, why does it remain the official version? The image that closes this segment is small and concrete. It is a certified copy stamped in 1909, the county seal pressed hard into the paper, and in the corner a handwritten cross-reference pointing to a book and page that a careful reader cannot cleanly locate. An official document that asks for trust while leaving a trail that doesn't quite exist. By 1915, the risk had matured into something almost absurd. The quieter the record remained, the more catastrophic its rediscovery would be. The Registry of Deeds, once a symbol of bureaucratic permanence, was now a potential fault line in the city's social foundation. The correction from 1908, still unexamined, still technically sound, had threaded itself through every institutional layer. All it would take to unwind the illusion was one person stumbling onto the uncorrected 1896 copy, the one preserved by habit rather than intention, tucked into a drawer no one had inventoried in years. The spark could have been minor. In early 1915, the Newport Herald had begun running serialized features on forgotten fortunes of the Gilded Age, spurred by renewed populist sentiment and a state inquiry into tax disparities. Reporters, eager for names once synonymous with luxury, descended on the registry searching for traces of vanished families. One, a young journalist named Arthur D. Lowell, reportedly requested access to Book 87, the same ledger that bore the Whitcomb deed. He was chasing background for a piece on idle mansions, not scandal. But if he had been given the wrong volume, or if an inattentive clerk had fetched the older certified copy from 1907, the chain of omission would have fractured on the spot. The contradiction would have been obvious even to a layman. Two certified copies, each bearing the county seal, each asserting exclusive authority, yet irreconcilable in detail. The 1896 version naming a Whitcomb, the 1908 correction naming the Atlantic Holding and Trust Co., one with a notary acknowledgement from a commission that expired in 1899, another using a standardized form adopted years later. For the press, this would not have been a curiosity. It would have been evidence that a legal document had been rewritten without judicial supervision. In the Progressive Era, amid crusades for transparency and municipal reform, such a revelation would have found immediate traction. The potential fallout extended far beyond one family's embarrassment. The registry of deeds would have faced a credibility crisis. If one record could be rewritten without process, how many others had been corrected? Attorneys would have re-examined conveyances certified in the same period. Banks, already nervous after the 1914 recession, would have questioned collateral valuations. Real estate lawyers like those at H.B. Winslow & Co., whose internal correspondence linked them to the 1908 request, would have been summoned before oversight committees. Even trustees of the Lincoln Trust Company, then a pillar of Newport finance, could have been implicated in a quiet scheme to sanitize records for reputational preservation. The political consequences would have been immediate. The county clerk's office was an elected position, often occupied by men with party affiliations and ambitions beyond the courthouse. In 1915, the incumbent clerk, George P. Whitman, was campaigning for a state Senate seat on a platform of administrative integrity. If a journalist had exposed a correction bearing his office's initials, Whitman's career would have ended in a week. Rival factions within the local Democratic Committee would have seized the chance to portray the registry as a sanctuary for the elite, where history could be tailored by request. The story would have transcended property law. It would have become a moral drama about privilege. Manipulating the public record, the mechanism of exposure was almost too simple to prevent. The uncorrected copy, stamped in 1907, still existed because registries rarely destroyed old certifications. They were kept in a folio marked issued copies prior to standardization. A single subpoena or public records request could have forced its disclosure. If Lowell, or any attorney representing a creditor or heir, had filed such a request, the county would have been compelled to produce both versions. The side-by-side comparison would not have required expertise to interpret. The contradiction would have been self-evident. In that hypothetical scenario, the implications spiral outward. The Providence Journal, always eager for moral spectacle, would have serialized the investigation. The record that disappeared. Editorials would have demanded a state audit of every county deed recorded between 1890 and 1910. Clerks from other districts would have quietly begun checking their ledgers, fearing contagion. The Newport Preservation Society, then cultivating donors for its first major public museum project, would have found its leadership under scrutiny. Several trustees were themselves beneficiaries of similar corrections. The reputational damage to the Whitcombs would have been surgical. The correction that once protected them from creditors would have become proof of manipulation. Their trusteeship, celebrated as stewardship, would have been reframed as concealment. Invitations to preservation boards would have evaporated. Gossip would have filled drawing rooms faster than any paper could print. For a family whose social capital relied on discretion, the exposure would have been worse than legal defeat. It would have been social exile, and the institutional wound would have cut deeper. The registry's authority depended on the illusion of mechanical neutrality. If that neutrality cracked, every piece of property in the county would become arguable. The courts, overwhelmed by re-examinations, would be forced to reaffirm the 1908 standard as valid simply to preserve order. In effect, the system would save itself by ratifying its own error. The scandal's only legacy would be to formalize the principle that procedure outranks truth. Within that fragile equilibrium lay the unspoken fear shared by every official who understood the record's origins. The risk of exposure was not that someone had lied, it was that someone could prove the record malleable. To prove that the past could be edited without trace was to expose the entire machinery of public trust as reversible. For years this remained a hypothetical. No reporter ever found the uncorrected copy. It stayed in its folio, filed alphabetically, its seal fading. But the possibility hovered, a dormant scandal whose mere existence shaped behavior. Clerks began tightening access to old volumes. Requests for certified copies were redirected through formal applications. Lawyers who once visited freely now required Appointments. By defending against one potential discovery, the institution quietly confirmed its vulnerability. And so, the risk endured like static beneath the calm surface of municipal order. Every bound ledger, every corrected page, carried the possibility that one mismatched line could collapse an entire architecture of trust. The image that ends this chapter belongs to that year, 1915, a summer morning in the registry of deeds. A reporter's hand rests on a wooden counter as a clerk closes. A drawer labeled "Issued Copies," prior to standardization. Inside lies a single envelope, its seal broken long ago, containing the older certification. The clerk locks the drawer. The story never prints. The scandal never happens. But the risk, the proof that history could have been rewritten, remains sealed inside. By 1924, what had begun as a single clerical correction had evolved into a method. The county clerk's office, reorganized after the war under a new generation of administrators, no longer remembered the 1908 episode as an anomaly. It had been absorbed into the logic of maintenance, an internal vocabulary of neutrality that treated intervention as preservation. The ledgers of the Registry of Deeds were aging, ink fading, bindings fraying, indexes too large to handle by hand. The reforms of the 1920s, standardization, microfilming, centralization, arrived with the language of care, not concealment. Yet, inside that language, silence acquired policy. A memo dated March 1924 from D.O. Chief Clerk Joseph W. Barlow to his departmental heads outlines the tone of the new era. All corrections shall be performed in such a way as to maintain consistency of form. The intent is not to alter, but to preserve legibility. The directive codified what had already become habit. Notes in margins, retyped index cards, missing cross-references, none of it was considered exceptional. The term clerical had become an absolution. To call an act clerical was to render it harmless by definition. The process was repetitive, mechanical, almost ritualistic. Each month, the index department reviewed a quota of aging entries. Clerks compared book indexes to master ledgers, checking spelling, pagination, and the alignment of grantor-grantee tables. When they found discrepancies, they stamped the file, adjusted per policy, 1924A. The accompanying explanation, to conform with standard, was identical in every case. No separate log of what had been changed was kept. Transparency was replaced by the assurance of uniformity. If all records looked the same, no one needed to ask what had been different. The Registry of Deeds began restricting access to older volumes to prevent deterioration. In practice, that meant few ever consulted the originals. Certified copies, newly typed and standardized, became the living version of history. The bound books, heavy, smudged, inconvenient, were sequestered in a locked annex under the label Preservation Archive. The word restricted appeared for the first time in internal inventories. It sounded archival, but it functioned as a barrier. The 1896 Whitcomb record, the 1908 correction, and the subsequent index sheets were all moved to this annex by year's end. No public notice accompanied the change. Inside the office, the culture of description changed as well. Instead of acknowledging differences, memos described harmonization. The vocabulary was self-defending, integrity of form, continuity of process, maintenance of legibility. Each phrase implied that intervention safeguarded the record rather than transformed it. By replacing the word alteration with maintenance, the office converted discretion into virtue. The result was a bureaucracy that could perform erasure without intent. This normalization carried consequences beyond the building. Attorneys drafting deeds learned the new conventions and began phrasing their filings to anticipate clerical alignment. The language of documents adapted to the office's tone. More generic, more compliant. In turn, future clerks had fewer anomalies to correct. The loop reinforced itself. Silence became systemic not through conspiracy, but through comfort, the belief that uniformity itself was truth. By 1924, even the county's policy manual on public access codified exclusion in neutral terms. Paragraph 17 reads, Certain volumes shall remain closed except by order of the clerk, where access may risk deterioration or misinterpretation. Misinterpretation, an elastic word, now. Justified restriction. The concern was not preservation of paper, but preservation of narrative coherence. The registry had become a curator of plausibility. A surviving letter from Assistant Archivist Lillian D. Morse to a state inspector that year captures the mindset with chilling precision. Our duty is to ensure the continuity of the record, not its debate. The less revision is discussed, the more stable our archives remain. She was not hiding wrongdoing. She was articulating policy. Stability had replaced accuracy as the institution's moral axis. The routine spread to related offices. Tax rolls mirrored the registry's indexes, using identical typefaces and the same column headers. Discrepancies that once might have signaled deeper inquiries were absorbed under clerical reconciliation. Even the State Bureau of Records, when inspecting the county's books in 1925, praised Newport for its exceptional uniformity and clarity. The inspection report used the phrase "no irregularities apparent." It did not mean there were none, only that none could be seen through the polished glass of consistency. The normalization had another effect. It rendered responsibility untraceable. When everything is a policy, nothing is a decision. If an old correction from 1908 still shaped the ownership narrative of a property in 1924, no single person could be said to have upheld or concealed it. The machinery of maintenance swallowed intention. What survived was a collective confidence in the safety of procedure. Silence was no longer chosen, it was inherited. Outside the registry, the Whitcomb estate persisted as architectural fiction. Visitors to Newport's historical preservation exhibits saw photographs labeled "Property of the Atlantic Holding and Trust Kaiser," unaware that the label itself was a relic of a correction. Even scholars compiling genealogies in the 1920s accepted the record's final form. The family's absence had become part of the city's official memory, so official that questioning it would have seemed eccentric. By the end of the decade, the office introduced a rubber stamp reading, "Verified and harmonized." It appeared on every retyped page, including the Whitcomb deed. Each impression removed individuality from the act of correction. What had once been a scandalous possibility in 1915, proof that the record could be rewritten, was now procedure. The clerks who applied the stamp likely never knew what it meant. The act was inherited. Routine, devoid of context, but rich in legitimacy. The institutional language that shielded these acts left its residue on every surface. Drawers labeled "preservation," memos marked "restricted," carbon copies filed under "adjusted." None of it sounded secret. The very banality of the vocabulary made it unassailable. Bureaucratic tone replaced intent. Repetition replaced reflection. The normalization of silence was complete when the registry introduced annual reports to the county board. These documents praised operational continuity and uniform presentation of records across decades. To auditors and administrators, that consistency looked like professionalism. To history, it read as amnesia. The system no longer needed to defend its opacity. It had learned to rename it as preservation. And that is how, by 1924, the correction that began as a discreet favor to a single estate became indistinguishable from the normal heartbeat of public record-keeping. The language that once disguised an exception had become the language of rule itself. The closing image is quiet, bureaucratic, and final. A clerk in a pressed vest, stamping "verified and harmonized" across a page already perfect. The echo of rubber on paper muffled by the hum of filing cabinets. The mark dries quickly. The act leaves no question, no pause, only the certainty that silence, once procedural, will never again require permission. In 2026, the record does not feel like paper. It feels like a search box. You sit at a county website that promises transparency with a clean interface. Public record search. The screen offers a familiar set of fields: grantor, grantee, book, page, date range. It looks modern, neutral, comforting. And if you type Whitcomb into the name field, the system returns exactly what the 20th century trained it to return. Nothing that matters. No mansion, no 1896 conveyance, no line that anchors the estate to the surname that once defined it. That absence is not an accident. It is the legacy of the correction becoming the database's foundation. Digital systems do not preserve ambiguity well. They prefer a single authoritative value. They are built to index the most current, standardized representation of the record. And so, when the registry's harmonized card index was digitized, the 1908 version entered the system as the truth, not because anyone chose it in 2026, but because it had already won the internal war of usability by 1924. The modern record is, in practice, the result of a chain of conversions. First, the handwritten index card becomes a type ledger. Then the type ledger becomes microfilm. Then microfilm becomes a scan. Then the scan becomes metadata. And metadata becomes searchable reality. In each conversion, anything that cannot be represented cleanly is either discarded or collapsed. Cross-references that once required a human to interpret become dead text. Marginal notes become faint images without machine-readable meaning. Here's the eye. Prior to standardization, copies that once sat in drawers are never ingested because they are not part of the sanctioned workflow. The digital portal does not lie. It simply reflects the version of the past that was easiest to standardize. In 2026, the county clerk's digital system shows ownership chains as discrete, bounded sequences. For the estate on Bellevue Avenue, the chain appears to begin with a trustee entity, Atlantic Holding and Trust Co., or its successor name after mid-century, mergers, and then continues forward through corporate reorganizations that look routine. Mergers, assignments, occasional quitclaim deeds filed for tax planning. The narrative is sterile. It contains no human origin. It contains no embarrassing transitional period. The record reads as if the property has always belonged to an institutional custodian, as if the mansion emerged fully formed into the administrative world of entities. This is where the present proves the past, because if you leave the website and go to the local historical archive, the story becomes physical again. In the reading room, an archivist brings out a scan from an older microfilm reel, the kind created before the last wave of metadata cleaning. The image quality is imperfect, the edges blur, the contrast shifts, but the 1896 book page is there, anchored by the old ritual of permanence, ink, seal, the notary's acknowledgement that belongs to its time. The name appears the way the digital system insists it never did. The grantor-grantee line is not ambiguous on the page. It is legible, stubborn, and human. Then you do the most basic action the digital era rarely requires. You compare. On the county portal, the record tied to Book 87, page 142 is indexed under the trustee entity, with a shortened, standardized name and an execution date aligned to the corrected timeline. The portal might even show an image attachment, often a later certified copy scan, because that is what was easiest to store. In the older scan, the 1896 page carries the original naming, the original structure, and in the margin, a later 1908 note that is visible but not truly integrated into the digital metadata. The modern system treats that marginal note as decoration. The paper treats it as intervention. The difference is not academic. In 2026, most people never see the page. They see the index. They see the database result. They see the sanitized ownership chain that begins from nowhere. And because the digital portal is treated as the official gateway to truth, the corrected version becomes the only accessible version for nearly everyone. Journalists working on deadline, attorneys doing rapid due diligence, historians writing summaries, tourists looking up who built this mansion. The earlier version survives only in the analog remainder, the scanned image that requires intention, permission, and physical effort to retrieve. Meanwhile, the public narrative of the mansion remains intact and unthreatened. The Preservation Society, whatever its modern name, whether a local historical association or a nonprofit that maintains house tours, still markets the estate as architectural heritage, a masterpiece of the Gilded Age, a symbol of Newport's summer colony, a location tied to old families in a broad, tasteful sense. Brochures and web pages describe the craftsmanship, the gardens, the social season. They rarely describe the administrative mechanics of ownership. They rarely name the people whose records built the institution's wealth. The story stays aesthetic, not documentary. The power behind the space becomes diffuse on purpose. A mansion belongs to the city's identity, rather than to a traceable chain of decisions. That is the edited past doing its work in the present. The correction did not just protect an estate from creditors or lawsuits in 1908. It shaped what the 21st century can easily know. When a digital system is built on a curated index, it amplifies the curation. It makes the curated version frictionless and makes the original version burdensome. In practical terms, that is not neutrality, it is reinforcement. The action that proves this in 2026 is almost embarrassingly simple. You run two searches. First, you search by name. Whitcomb. The portal returns nothing tied to the estate. That absence can be screenshot, time-stamped, treated as fact. Second, you search by book and page. 87-142. The portal returns a deed record, but it identifies the parties. According to the corrected metadata, the trustee entity, the standardized name form, the adjusted date. The system offers a confidence it did not earn. The book and page are real, but the story attached to them is a product of the correction pipeline. Then you take the older scan, zoom into the margin, and read the stamp. Corrected, dated May 12, 1908, initialed by a deputy clerk. In the digital world, that stamp is merely an image artifact. In the real world, it is a historical event. It is the moment a record stopped being purely archival and became managerial. The stamp explains why the portal behaves the way it does. It explains why the search result is clean. The consequence in the present is structural. Modern digitization does not merely preserve records. It prioritizes the versions that were easiest to formalize. If the corrected entry was treated as official for a century, digitization hardens it into the only accessible truth. The earlier copy becomes a ghost that exists only for those willing to pursue it. That changes power, not the obvious kind, votes, money, lawsuits, but the quieter power of what can be asserted confidently in public. In 1908, the correction edited accountability. In 1924, policy language turned that editing into routine. In 2026, the database completes the cycle. The corrected version is not simply preferred, it is operational reality. It is what the public can find. It is what institutions will cite. It is what becomes the city's official memory. The closing image is contemporary and stark. A laptop screen shows a blank result for Whitcomb, the cursor blinking as if the name never existed. Beside it, under archival light, a printed scan of Book 87, page 142 shows the name in 19th century ink, still there, still legible, and still separated from the modern world by one quiet administrative stamp. By 2026, the search box has replaced the courthouse counter, and the county seal has been reduced to a digital watermark. Yet, the outcome is the same as it was in the age of ink. What can be found becomes what can be believed, and what can be believed becomes what can be defended. The record does not merely survive, it governs. This story began in 1896 with the confidence of a bound volume, a deed entered into a public book with the quiet arrogance of permanence. In 1908, the same act acquired a second life, a correction, stamped and initialed, polite in tone and catastrophic in reach. By 1912, the name that once clung to a facade of stone and iron had slipped out of directories, tax rolls, and civic memory. In 1924, the language of clerical maintenance hardened into policy, and the office learned to treat intervention as stewardship. And in 2026, digitization did what digitization always does. It chose the version that was administratively coherent and offered it as the only version most people will ever touch. What endures across those dates is not a single error, but a single institutional logic. The registry of deeds, the county clerk, the index department, the certified copy. Each exists to make property legible, transferable, provable. But when provability becomes an instrument rather than a principle, the archive ceases to be a mirror. It becomes architecture. It decides which doors open, which corridors lead nowhere, which names remain visible in the lamplight, and which are absorbed into the shadows of trustee, holding, entity, preservation. The line between correction and rewriting is not technical. It is political. Not politics in speeches or elections, but politics in the oldest sense, the management of what a city agrees is real. A record is power because it defines what can be proven without argument. And once you understand that, you begin to see the elegance of the method. The truth does not need to be destroyed. It only needs to be replaced by a version that is official enough to satisfy routine and convenient enough to end disputes before they begin. We traced the chain as it unfolded, step by step, without theatrics. The discovery of two versions where there should have been one. The marginal evidence, small, administrative, and decisive. The context of risk, when reputations were protected as fiercely as fortunes. The internal decision, made in a short meeting and expressed in neutral language. The alteration, performed through indexing and certification rather than violence. The beneficiary, who did not need to argue, only to enjoy the silence. The disappearance as civic documents stopped using human names. The inconsistency, when the correction began to generate new contradictions while still being treated as the clean version. The risk of scandal, hanging over the courthouse like a storm that never breaks. The normalization, when clerical became a shield strong enough to cover anything. And the present, where a digital portal amplifies the edited past and offers the correction as history itself. And still, we have not resolved the central question, because the archive is designed to resist resolution. It is designed to look complete, to feel final, to leave the visitor satisfied that nothing remains behind the locked door. Yet every system that can correct without visibility can correct again. Every index that can be harmonized can be curated. Every certified copy that can outrank the book can be issued in a form that makes the older version irrelevant. The halls remain quiet not because there is nothing left to find, but because the institution learned how to keep the search polite. If this investigation resonated with you, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury, and consider subscribing so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens, because if you're willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. As the courthouse lights dim, the ledger returns to its shelf. The drawer marked "Restricted" clicks shut, and the stamped version continues to circulate with immaculate confidence, official, sufficient, and quietly incomplete. Some secrets survive not because they were hidden perfectly, but because those who feared them learned to leave no single place where the whole truth could be proven at once.